Hello, this is the second video where we are discussing The Prince, the political treatise written by Niccolo Machiavelli. As we mentioned in the previous video, this particular work was in many ways Niccolo Machiavelli's attempt to get back into the political world. As we discussed in the first video, the first section of the text is actually a published letter that he wrote to Francisco Vettori, who was an ambassador in Rome. It was really Niccolo Machiavelli's way to reach out to someone whom he knew was still involved in politics, and then he was hoping that this would kind of be sort of, the way for him to re-enter the political realm. He also dedicated the Prince to Lorenzo de' Medici. However, Lorenzo was somewhat indifferent to this. It wasn't until later, when another de' Medici official took over, that Niccolo Machiavelli was given some very, very small political tasks. But sadly, those did not last very long, because essentially the Holy Roman Empire in 1530 sacked Rome, and of course they came under their power. And because of that overthrow, Niccolo Machiavelli pretty much lost any connection to politics that he had before. And sadly, he died in many ways heartbroken, I think, because of that particular incident. Now, as far as our discussion of some of the books, we sadly do not have all of the chapters of The Prince. We only have a few. And I'm actually going to go out of order with these, because I want us to start with some of the most important concepts. Now, you're going to notice I actually start here with book 15. Now, book 15 starts at the bottom of 1631. I'd like to start with this one because to me it's really at the essence of what Machiavelli was discussing. Now, I'm sure if any of you have read a Shakespearean tragedy, by William Shakespeare, whether it's Othello, Hamlet, Macbeth, those are just example of a few, that Shakespeare is known for having not only protagonists, but sometimes antagonists who are considered Machiavellian. In many ways, Shakespeare, you could say he was very stereotypical in his belief system of Italians, like many British people of that time period. When The Prince was published, many people kind of typecast Italians as being manipulative or deceptive. And William Shakespeare was similar of that belief system. For example, in his tragic play, Othello, he has the antagonist Iago, who is an Italian, who presents himself by appearance to be this kind, humble friend to everyone around him. But in reality, he's actually a very ruthless, manipulative, just con artist who is out to, just gain revenge on those he perceives who have wronged him. And it doesn't matter who it is he hurts or kills, which I don't want to give too much away in relationship to the Othello if you've never read it. But I do want you to understand this idea of appearance versus reality. That's a very important theme in a lot of Shakespeare's tragedies. That is a concept that kind of actually began with this particular work, The Prince. Because as far as Niccolo Machiavelli, he states that by appearance, a leader should appear to be pious, good. But in reality, behind closed doors, when need be, there needs to be manipulation, ruthlessness, okay? Executions, imprisonment, torture, whatever it might be. So I want you to understand that kind of that idea of appearance versus reality is kind of rooted in this particular work. So let's look at just a few things with chapter 15 on page 1631. So Machiavelli tells his readers, I know that many have written on this topic, meaning the topic of leadership and how to rule one's country or region. He says, I fear that when I too write, I shall be thought presumptuous. Okay, because in discussing it, I break away completely from the principles laid down by my predecessors. And we mentioned this earlier. Before, people equated morality with effective leadership. Machiavelli's not doing that. He's severing that tie. Okay, he says, but since it's my purpose to write something useful, he says, to an attentive reader, I think it more effective to go back to the practical truth. So he's like, I'm going to tell you the truth about leadership. He says, I'm not going to have any fancies about it. He says, many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in reality, saying you imagine these utopias of government, but they've never really occurred. He says, there's a difference between the way men live and the way they ought to live. He says that anybody who abandons what it is for to be ought will learn something that will ruin rather than to preserve him. He says if a prince wishes to maintain himself, meaning leadership, he says he must learn how not to be good. And to use that ability or not is required. So he's like, listen, I'm going against what other people have said about leadership. I'm going to be truthful and honest about it. To have an effective region or kingdom, you have to be bad sometimes, essentially, is what he's saying. Now, notice he says, all men, especially princes, because they are set higher, are marked with some of the qualities that bring them either blame or praise. They have qualities that are either good or bad, at least perceived in that manner. He says, to wit, one man is thought liberal, another stingy. And he says, he basically then lists on 1632 kind of opposing adjectives to describe someone, one perceived as good, one perceived as bad. So he says, one is thought open-handed, another grasping, one cruel, another compassionate, one a breaker of faith, the other reliable, one effeminate, one cowardly. And then he keeps going back and forth between these polar opposites. And he's basically stating, should we completely have a black or a white area as far as qualifying or classifying someone as a leader? Can we have some gray areas where sometimes those particular qualities, they have to be manipulated to be an effective leader? So notice what he says. He says, and I know that everybody will admit it would be very praiseworthy for a prince to possess all the above mentioned qualities that are good. He's like, hey, it'd be great if a prince, a leader, had those good qualities. He says, but since he's not able to have them or to observe them completely, because human conditions do not allow him to. He says being a human in essence is imperfection. So there's no way someone can be perfect with those positive qualities every moment of their lives. It is necessary that he is prudent, meaning intelligent enough, to understand how to avoid getting a bad name because he's given to those vices that will deprive him in that position. So you need to be cautionary not to be labeled those bad things, but that doesn't mean that you might not necessarily perform those bad acts. You just don't need to be found out. He says, it will be seen that some things that seem virtuous, but if they are put into practice, will be ruinous to him. Other things seem to be vices, yet when to be put into practice, it will bring the prince security and well-being. Now, I'm really sad that our particular textbook does not have one particular chapter. It's a great analogy of these terms. It gives the example of being liberal or persinimous with your money, with your wealth, okay? Now, as far as Niccolo Machiavelli's thoughts, he says, okay, you may have a leader who showers his citizens with money, with wealth. Maybe donates land to organizations, to people. Also, maybe builds beautiful buildings for their enjoyment. Think of any public servant building, whether it's a museum or a park, whatever it might be. He says, if you're liberal in your spending, that appears to be positive. Big but, though. Later, who has to pay for all of those funds that were used, of course, to build the structures, to give those allowances? Again, it's the citizens. They have to pay the big T, taxes. So he says, listen, although it seems positive to be liberal in your spending as a government official, at the end of the day, that's not the wisest move because you need to save your money. And also, although people won't view that as positive because maybe you are being stingy and maybe giving out money to citizens, you'll have money to have an army to protect your citizens because the wealth will be there. So that's just one example that he gives that I hate it's not in this particular chapter, but he gives that as an example of the difference between being liberal in spending money, giving it to your citizens, versus persinimous, okay? He also offers another kind of analogy. Probably one of the most famous questions that he offers is it better to be loved or is it better to be feared? And he basically states it's better to be feared because he says that people change, their allegiances and loyalties change, and because of that, you need to be feared. You don't need to be hated necessarily, but you need to be feared. People need to fear the repercussions of their actions. You do need to have public punishments. You need to have arrest. You need to maybe even have harsh punishments where others see it. And again, you don't need to go too far. He says that a prince should be compassionate, not cruel, but be feared rather than loved. And notice he says that you can be feared but not necessarily hated. He says one thing is that obviously, and he's thinking more in kind of kind of classical viewpoints, he says one thing that a leader shouldn't do is you don't mess with your subjects' lands, you don't take their lands away, and you don't touch their women, meaning your men should not partake in the women, which violently, we're thinking rapes. That's something you don't do. But he basically states that, lawless acts from the citizens, that those would injure the whole country. So you do have to punish. You can't just allow your citizens to run wild. Now, he also says that there's two ways to fight. There's laws, there's force. He basically states that you need to be a fox, using your wit, using your intelligence, but if need be, you have to be the lion and use brute force to enforce the leadership that you have. And probably one of the most important things, besides the being feared over being, of course, loved, is you have to be a skillful pretender. And that really goes into book 15. You need to be perceived by your people to be virtuous, but then behind closed doors be able to maintain your government and be able to do so in very ruthless, manipulative ways. Now, as far as Niccolo Machiavelli, where he got some of these ideas, he mentioned, you'll notice on page 1629 all the way from 1631, he talks about, of course, Rodrigo Borgia, who is Pope Alexander VI. Now, Pope Alexander VI, he bought the papacy. And with that act, he also wanted to ensure that his children were given positions. So what he did was he basically manipulated individuals around him, particularly, and it mentions this on 1629 and 1630, there were two families, the Orsini's and also the Colonneses, and they were two power families in the Romagna area, the region. Now, he set them fighting against each other, but also he used his connections with the French government to basically cause them to eradicate each other. Now, after those power families were out, he could then institute his son, Cesare Borgia, to be the Duke of Romagna, Duke Valentino. Now, you can probably imagine the people were not very impressed with this little boy, this young man coming in because of his father's, connections and taking over this position. They were unruly. But notice what Caesar Borgia did. He did something very intelligent. He actually, and this is noted on 1631, he was manipulative. He sent in someone named Miser Miradiorca, and he gave his lieutenant, if you want to call him that, pretty much power to do anything ruthless to control the people of Romagna. Now, you can imagine Miser Ramiro Diorca, tongue-tied there. He essentially was very harsh with the people. He punished them. He imprisoned them. He tortured. He had public executions. He was ruthless. Now, notice what Cesare did, though. He comes in and he basically is like, oh, I did not realize Diorca was taking these horrible acts against you, so I will punish him. And notice what happens. He actually takes his lieutenant and publicly executes him very violently to appease the people of Romagna. But he does this to show by appearance that he's loyal to them. He will work to protect them. Now, in reality, he actually asked this person, Diorca, to come into Romagna. He asked him to do these ruthless things to control the government. So you'll notice Cesare Borgia, he was, at least from Niccolo Machiavelli's perception, a very effective leader. But he's not perfect. Notice fate comes into play. And this is probably another interesting argument that's made by the prince. In chapter 25, fate comes into play. Now, sadly, Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, he dies of malaria. You can imagine once he dies, what happens to his children and all of their, titles and wealth. Okay, another pope comes in, Pope Julius II. He comes into power. They see Cesare Borgia as a threat, so they exile him. And Cesare Borgia sadly dies not long after that. So you're going to notice this idea of fate, fortune. You can't always have success unless you change with the times. Now, what's interesting and ironic about this particular chapter is in The Prince, we essentially have Machiavelli, who's also trying to change with the tides of political change. He tries to work under the Borgias. He tries to work under the De Medicis. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But sadly, at the end, when the Holy Roman Empire invades, he can't work against that. He's exiled from the government, politics forever, and it breaks his heart. And in many ways, that is the sad end to Niccolo Machiavelli. Thank you.